The millionaire CEO was sipping whiskey alone, until he spotted two birthday boys in paper hats, sitting without a cake, or a parent, in sight. Jason Carter didn't believe in fate. He believed in numbers, strategy, and discipline, principles that had taken him from a forgotten childhood to the sleek corner office of one of the most powerful investment firms in the country. That evening, he had no intention of making any decisions beyond whether he'd order a second glass of whiskey. He entered the quiet bar on the edge of the city out of habit more than desire, a place he'd once frequented before the world started recognizing his name. It was quiet inside, dim but warm, with the kind of low jazz that filled the silence without intruding. He took his usual seat near the window, away from the bar, and signaled for a Macallan, neat. It was supposed to be an uneventful moment of stillness at the end of another day crammed with meetings and managed expectations. He leaned back in the leather chair, loosened his tie slightly, and exhaled. The amber liquid glinted in the low light as he lifted the glass to his lips. He hadn't even looked around the room yet. But when he did, his eyes paused at a small table in the far corner of the bar, where two boys sat side by side. They were around 6 years old, maybe younger, their blonde curls messy from the wind, both wearing oversized paper birthday hats that slouched slightly to the side. In front of them sat two sad cupcakes, candles already melted and untouched, and a single gift bag resting between them like a silent witness. There were no balloons. No friends. No parents. Just the boys, quietly sitting there as if waiting for someone who hadn't shown up. Jason frowned, setting his glass down. Something about the image twisted in his chest, though he couldn't explain why. The boys weren't crying. In fact, they weren't speaking at all. They just stared at their table with an eerie stillness, one that didn't belong on faces so young. It took him a moment to realize what was missing: joy. There wasn't even a hint of it in their expressions. He called the bartender over and asked who they were. The man, polishing a glass behind the counter, sighed. They come here every year. Their mom used to bring them for their birthday. This is the first year she didn't show up. Word is she's in a coma. Car accident. They came anyway. Said they had to keep the tradition. Brought their own cupcakes. Jason blinked slowly, the words settling into him like cold water. He turned back toward them. They hadn't moved. Their backs were straight, hands folded in their laps. They looked too proper, too practiced, like they were doing their best to be good, because they had no idea what else to do. Without thinking, Jason stood and crossed the room, his footsteps quiet on the hardwood floor. He stopped just beside their table and crouched so he was at their level. "Hey there," he said gently. "Happy birthday." Both boys looked up at once, their eyes wide and round, one pair golden brown, the other nearly identical. One of them, the boy on the left, nodded politely. "Thank you, sir." "I'm Jason," he said. "Do you mind if I sit with you for a bit?" The second boy glanced at his brother, then back at Jason, and nodded slowly. Jason took the empty seat. The table was sticky from the frosting, and the candles had burned low and curved into the icing. The sight of it made Jason's throat tighten. "I'm Cody," said the first boy. "He's Cameron." "Nice to meet you, Cody and Cameron," Jason said, managing a smile. "You guys come here a lot?" Cody nodded again. "Every birthday. Mom says it's our tradition." He looked down at his cupcake. "She usually makes it special." Jason leaned in just slightly. "And today?" "Today she couldn't come," Cameron whispered. "She's sleeping at the hospital. We thought, maybe if we came, she'd wake up. Because she always does." Jason didn't respond right away. He just sat there, absorbing every word, feeling a strange and unfamiliar ache settle in his chest. He glanced back at the bar, where his untouched whiskey now looked irrelevant. Then he looked at the boys again, at their soft faces and hopeful silence. He realized he wasn't here for peace tonight. He had come for something else, something he never saw coming. And though he couldn't name it yet, a part of him already knew he wouldn't be walking away. Jason didn't leave the bar that night. Instead, he stayed with Cody and Cameron, and what began as a quiet, polite moment stretched into an unexpected evening. After sitting down at their table, he ordered 2 glasses of warm milk and asked the bartender if they had any extra candles, anything to make the boys smile even slightly. The bartender, moved by the sight of them, brought over a small box of crayons and a napkin, apologizing that they didn't have coloring books. Jason thanked him and handed the crayons to the boys, suggesting they draw their favorite birthday memory. Cody began sketching a large cake with flowers, while Cameron drew their mom with what looked like a crown on her head. Jason listened as they described past birthdays, how their mom used to make the best spaghetti in the world, and always sang the birthday song with a silly voice that made them laugh. They told him about the time she had baked a cake shaped like a dinosaur and accidentally dropped it on the floor, and they all ended up laughing and eating pizza instead. He watched their faces change as they remembered, sadness still present, but softened by nostalgia. He asked them if they were okay staying alone, and they explained that their neighbor, Miss Ruth, had walked them there and was supposed to come back soon. Jason made a mental note of the name, and his protective instinct sharpened. When the waitress returned to clear the plates, she gave Jason a quiet nod of appreciation, recognizing that he was doing more than just passing time. He glanced at his watch. It was well past 8. The boys were clearly tired, rubbing their eyes and yawning between sentences, but they seemed content for the first time all day. He offered to walk them back home with Miss Ruth when she arrived, and they agreed without hesitation. Something about him made them feel safe, and that realization hit him with more force than he was prepared for. 15 minutes later, a short, elderly woman appeared at the door of the bar, her coat soaked from the drizzle outside. She greeted the boys with relief and thanked Jason, though her tone was wary, as any guardians would be. Jason introduced himself politely, giving her his business card, explaining that he had stayed with them when he noticed they were alone. Miss Ruth looked down at the card, then up at him again, her eyes narrowing in recognition. "You're the man on the magazines," she said quietly. "The money man." "I suppose I am," Jason replied with a soft smile. "But tonight, I was just someone who didn't want to see 2 kids celebrate their birthday by themselves." She softened then and gave him a small nod of gratitude. The 4 of them left together, walking the boys home under Miss Ruth's worn umbrella. Jason stayed a step behind, watching the way the twins held each other's hands without needing to speak. When they reached the building, Miss Ruth insisted he didn't need to come up, but he gave her another card, just in case. As they disappeared into the stairwell, Jason stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, hands in his pockets, the cool night pressing in around him. He hadn't intended to stay. He hadn't intended to feel. But something about Cody and Cameron, about their quiet strength, their need, their story, had stirred something he hadn't let himself feel in years. Back in his apartment, the silence felt different. It wasn't peaceful or comforting. It was empty. He looked around at the clean, organized space, untouched by childhood chaos or laughter. For the first time, it felt wrong. That night, he didn't go over spreadsheets or emails. He sat on his couch with a notebook in hand, jotting down the boys' names, the date, the location of the bar. Something inside him had shifted, and though he didn't know what he was going to do next, he was certain of one thing: he wasn't done with Cody and Cameron. And somehow, he had a feeling his story with them had only just begun. The next morning, Jason arrived at his office early, but something about his usual routine felt hollow. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered the same sprawling view of the skyline, his desk was perfectly ordered as always, and the day's agenda was printed and waiting. But for the first time in years, he didn't sit at his desk to dive into work. Instead, he stood staring out at the city, thinking about 2 boys in paper birthday hats, alone at a table with melted cupcakes. No part of his schedule could override the weight of that image, and as the sun climbed higher, he knew he had to do something more than just remember them. He called Rachel, his longtime assistant, and asked her to come in. When she arrived with her usual calm demeanor and tablet in hand, she found him standing in the middle of the office, completely out of rhythm. She raised an eyebrow, sensing something unusual immediately. He told her about the twins, how he met them, what they'd said, and what he had seen. Rachel, sharp and deeply loyal, listened quietly, then nodded and asked, "What do you want me to do?" Jason didn't hesitate. "Find their mother. Her name is Sarah Jenkins. I think she's in a coma at City General." Rachel got to work while Jason tried, and failed, to focus on his usual meetings. He found himself distracted, tuning out presentations, staring at charts without seeing them. By lunchtime, Rachel returned to his office with information. Sarah Jenkins, age 32, had been admitted to City General 2 months ago after a car accident. Her injuries had left her in a medically induced coma. No emergency contact had been listed. The boys, Cody and Cameron, had been living in a small apartment in a modest neighborhood, under the informal care of an elderly neighbor. Child Protective Services had been made aware of the situation but hadn't intervened yet due to Sarah's prior arrangements and the boys' stability. Jason sat in silence, reading the report. Every detail made the ache in his chest deepen. They had no father listed. No extended family on file. It was just them, 2 children barely old enough to cross a street alone, managing as best they could. He asked Rachel to prepare a gift package, nothing extravagant, just groceries, a few toys, and supplies, and have it delivered anonymously. Then he asked for a driver to take him to the apartment building. He didn't know exactly what he would say when he got there. He only knew that leaving things as they were wasn't an option anymore. When he arrived, the building looked exactly how he'd imagined. A brick walk-up with peeling paint and windows framed with mismatched curtains. Miss Ruth answered the door again, surprised but not cold. She stepped aside and let him in, watching him carefully as he entered the small but tidy apartment. The boys were sitting on the floor, coloring. They looked up and smiled as soon as they saw him. "You came back," Cameron said, scrambling to his feet. "We thought maybe you wouldn't remember us," Cody added. Jason knelt down beside them and smiled. "I couldn't forget you even if I tried." They launched into stories about their day, how they'd both aced a spelling quiz and how their teacher said they could bring a show and tell item next week. Miss Ruth brought in a tray of water and crackers, and though she didn't say much, her eyes were watching Jason with less suspicion now. After an hour, when the boys were busy building a tower out of cereal boxes, Jason finally turned to her. "I'd like to help," he said quietly. "Not just with groceries or toys. I want to make sure they're okay. That they're safe. That you're not doing this all alone." Miss Ruth hesitated. "Why?" she asked, not unkindly. "You don't even know them." Jason looked toward the boys. "No, I didn't. But sometimes, you meet people and just know you're meant to do something for them. I didn't ask for it. But I don't want to walk away from it either." She studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "If you mean it, there's a lot they need. But mostly, they just need someone who won't disappear." Jason promised her he wouldn't. And as he left the apartment that evening, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: purpose, stripped of ego, of profit, of ambition. Just the kind of purpose that comes when a life quietly begins to change course. Jason began showing up more frequently after that evening. At first it was a couple of times a week, under the guise of checking in on Miss Ruth or dropping off groceries, but it didn't take long for his visits to become part of Cody and Cameron's new routine. The boys began expecting him, watching for the familiar black car outside their apartment window and racing to the door when he arrived. He brought puzzles, library books, and new notebooks for school. Sometimes he helped them with homework, awkward at first as he relearned fractions and spelling rules, but the boys were patient with him, and before long they were laughing together over silly mistakes and made-up vocabulary. He quickly realized they were remarkably self-sufficient for 6-year-olds. They knew how to fold their own clothes, pack their school lunches, and wash dishes without being asked. It was a survival kind of maturity, the kind that should never sit on such young shoulders. That unspoken resilience broke Jason more than their birthday had. At his office, he found himself staring at photos of balance sheets with no interest, flipping through quarterly reports without absorbing a word. He told Rachel to clear his evenings. He wasn't sure when he'd be home, and for the first time, he didn't care about appearances or what questions the board might ask. Miss Ruth, meanwhile, began to trust him. She saw how gently he spoke to the boys, how present he was, not just physically but emotionally, and that kind of consistency was something the twins hadn't had since their mother fell into a coma. Jason began picking them up from school. The first time he showed up outside their classroom, a few parents gave him confused glances, wondering what a sharply dressed man with cufflinks was doing among lunchboxes and crayon stains. But Cody and Cameron ran to him with the kind of joy that silenced any suspicion. One of their teachers even thanked him privately, explaining that the boys had seemed lighter lately, more talkative, more engaged. One rainy afternoon, Jason took them to a bookstore. He let them each choose 2 books, and while they were browsing, he bought a third one secretly. When they got home, he handed it to them as a surprise, a large, hardcover storybook filled with fables. That night, the 3 of them sat cross-legged in the living room and took turns reading aloud. Cody voiced the fox, Cameron read the prince, and Jason, to their amusement, had to speak in a high-pitched voice for the fairy. It was ridiculous. It was perfect. And it was the first time in years that Jason had gone to bed feeling not just tired, but full. Later that week, Miss Ruth pulled him aside. They stood in the hallway of the apartment building, just outside the door, the boys inside cleaning up their paper crafts. She looked at him with clear eyes, tired but kind. "They're changing," she said. "Not because of gifts or games. But because they trust you now. They think you're going to stay." Jason swallowed hard. "I am." She nodded. "Good. Because if you weren't, I'd tell you to stop coming." He understood. The boys had been let down before. They didn't need another promise that came and went. That night, as Jason sat in his car outside the building, he pulled out his phone and opened the contact for his legal team. His fingers hovered over the screen for a long time. He wasn't ready to explain everything to the world, not yet. But he was ready to take responsibility in ways that mattered. He sent a short message, "Need to talk about temporary guardianship." Discreetly. It was the first official step. But in his heart, the real decision had already been made the moment Cody handed him that crayon drawing of the 3 of them holding hands under a bright blue sky. The words, "Our family," were written in messy 6-year-old letters at the bottom. He kept it in his briefcase from that day on. One Friday morning, Jason arrived at the hospital earlier than he planned. He hadn't visited Sarah Jenkins before, though he had received regular updates through contacts he trusted. He had wanted to give the boys stability first, to make sure they had someone present for them before he shifted his attention to the woman who had raised them alone. But today something inside him felt restless, an urgency he couldn't quite explain. He walked down the long, sterile corridor of the hospital with a quiet tension in his chest, carrying a small bouquet of flowers he had picked up on the way, yellow tulips, the kind Cameron once said were their mom's favorite. When he reached her room, the door was half open, and the room inside was dimly lit. Machines hummed softly, a steady rhythm of monitored breaths and beeps. Sarah lay motionless in the bed, her face pale but calm, her brown hair brushed back neatly on the pillow. She looked peaceful, almost as if she were just sleeping. Jason stepped in quietly and stood near the foot of the bed, unsure of what to say or do. He had faced some of the most powerful people in the world in boardrooms, had negotiated deals worth millions, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for this silent moment. He placed the flowers in a narrow glass vase on the small table by the window and sat down in the chair beside her bed. For a long time, he just watched her breathe, not speaking, just trying to imagine the life she'd lived with Cody and Cameron before everything changed. He didn't know what kind of mother she had been, but if the boys were any reflection of her, she must have been extraordinary, strong, loving, endlessly patient. He thought about how fiercely they protected her memory, how they still clung to routines she had created, as if keeping them alive would bring her back. After a while, he began to speak. His voice was low, uncertain at first. He told her who he was, not as the CEO or a man with wealth and power, but as the stranger who couldn't walk away from her sons. He told her about their birthday, about the cupcakes and paper hats, about the way they sat together with hope in their eyes and no one around to light their candles. He told her how they had let him into their lives without hesitation, how they laughed when he read bedtime stories, how they asked him things like whether foxes could live in cities and whether pancakes could be square. He told her how much they missed her. As he spoke, something shifted in him. The guilt he hadn't allowed himself to name until now started rising. Not because he had failed them, but because he had waited so long to let this part of himself exist. He apologized to Sarah, quietly and without expectation. He promised he would do everything he could to protect them until she woke up, and even after. He said he didn't want to replace her or take anything away. He only wanted to be what the boys needed. And maybe, if life allowed it, he could be that for her too. Just before he stood to leave, he gently reached for her hand. It was cool but warm enough to tell him that life still pulsed beneath the skin. He held it lightly in his own and gave it the smallest squeeze, not expecting anything in return. But in that fragile silence, her fingers moved. Only slightly, barely more than a twitch. He froze. Then it happened again. He rushed to the nurse's station, his voice calm but urgent, explaining what he saw. Within minutes, doctors and nurses were in the room, surrounding her with quiet efficiency, checking monitors, asking questions, making notes. Jason stood back, heart pounding, watching the chaos unfold with a strange mix of hope and fear. One of the nurses turned to him and said, "This is a good sign." "Very good." He didn't say anything. He just nodded, eyes fixed on Sarah's still face, his thoughts spinning. As he left the hospital, he didn't call the office. He called Rachel and told her to cancel his weekend meetings. Then he called Miss Ruth and asked her to tell the boys he'd be coming over early that evening, and that he had news. What he didn't say was that something was changing, something big, something irreversible. He didn't know what the next step looked like, but he was finally ready for whatever it would be. Because this wasn't just about stepping in anymore. It was about standing beside them, fully and without hesitation. And for the first time in his life, Jason Carter was no longer afraid of what that might mean. When Jason arrived at the apartment that evening, he found the boys sitting cross-legged on the living room floor, building something with old blocks and cereal boxes. Cameron looked up first, his eyes lighting up when he saw Jason standing in the doorway. Cody followed, immediately setting down the piece he was holding to run over and hug him. Their energy was so pure, so trusting, that Jason had to pause for a moment before speaking, unsure how to deliver the news in a way they would understand. Miss Ruth emerged from the kitchen, drying her hands on a towel, and gave him a quiet nod of acknowledgement before retreating, sensing that this moment belonged to them. Jason knelt down on the floor beside the boys and gently asked them to sit with him for a moment. Their smiles faded slightly, not out of fear, but because they sensed something important was coming. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded photograph that the hospital staff had given him earlier that day. It was a simple shot of their mother in her hospital bed, her eyes still closed but her face serene and peaceful. He handed it to Cody, who stared at it in silence, and then passed it to his brother. "I went to see your mom today," Jason said quietly, watching their faces carefully. "She moved her hand while I was there. The doctors think it means she's starting to wake up." For a moment, neither boy said anything. Then Cameron's lower lip began to tremble. "Really?" he whispered, holding the photo tightly against his chest. Jason nodded, and suddenly Cody was clinging to his side, arms wrapped tightly around him, face buried in Jason's shoulder. Cameron followed, and the three of them sat there on the rug in a tangle of small arms and quiet tears. They weren't loud sobs, they were the kind of tears that came from months of fear slowly unraveling into hope. When they had calmed, Jason helped them settle onto the couch and let them ask anything they wanted. They asked what the hospital smelled like, whether their mom had spoken, if she had asked about them. Jason answered each question as gently and truthfully as he could. He told them that she hadn't spoken yet but that the doctors were optimistic. He told them that she was in a quiet room with flowers and soft music, that someone was always there checking on her. He told them that he had held her hand and promised to take care of them until she was better. After a long pause, Cody looked at him seriously and asked, "Will you still come even if she wakes up?" Jason felt the weight of the question like a stone in his chest. He didn't hesitate. "Yes," he said. "I'm not going anywhere. Not now. Not ever." The boys nodded, and Jason could see that it mattered more than anything else he had said. He spent the night helping them draw pictures for their mom, bright, messy sketches of trees and houses, one with a fox wearing sunglasses and one of the four of them sitting in a garden. He promised to deliver them to the hospital in the morning, and they made him rehearse exactly what he would say when he showed her the drawings. Before bed, they insisted he read a chapter from their favorite book. As he read, his voice soft and steady, he noticed Cody resting his head on his lap, and Cameron curling up beside him. They didn't ask if he would stay until they fell asleep. They didn't need to. When the story ended and their breathing had deepened into sleep, Jason remained there for a while, one hand resting lightly on Cody's back. Miss Ruth peeked in from the hallway and whispered, "You're doing more for them than you even realize." Jason looked up, his expression both humbled and resolute. "I hope so. I just want them to feel safe." "They do," she said simply. "And it's changing them. You're giving them something they didn't think they could have anymore." Jason tucked the boys in and turned out the light. As he stood at the window looking out into the dark, he realized that he wasn't just part of their lives temporarily. He had become something solid. Something permanent. He thought about Sarah lying in the hospital bed, about the hope in her son's eyes, and about the promise he had made aloud and silently again and again. This was no longer about redemption or duty. It was about love. Real, rooted, transformative love that demanded presence and patience and courage. And for the first time in his life, Jason understood exactly what that meant. In the days following Sarah's brief movement, Jason visited the hospital every morning before the sun had fully risen. He sat beside her, sometimes reading aloud from the book the boys had chosen, other times simply talking to her about the drawings they had made or how Cameron had spilled juice on the carpet and tried to clean it with sock puppets. He brought in their pictures one at a time and taped them gently to the wall beside her bed, so she would see them if and when she opened her eyes. He spoke to her as if she were already listening, not out of optimism but because deep inside, he believed she was. The doctors continued to monitor her closely, and though progress was slow, the staff agreed that something had changed. At home, Jason was fully immersed in the lives of Cody and Cameron. He had rearranged his work schedule entirely, leaving the firm in the hands of trusted executives and working remotely when necessary. His penthouse, once pristine and empty, now resembled the home of a man with two 6-year-olds, books and toys filled the living room, drawings were taped to the refrigerator, and bedtime was no longer negotiable. He had even learned how to braid tangled curls, how to make grilled cheese without burning it, and how to explain thunderstorms without using science. His days, once scheduled down to the second, were now driven by lunchbox preferences, bedtime rituals, and which twin had hidden the other's sock. One evening, as he helped the boys build a blanket fort in the living room, Rachel called. She told him that the legal paperwork he had filed for temporary guardianship had gone through with no opposition. The courts had acknowledged the emergency and his involvement and granted him full care for as long as necessary. Jason stood in the kitchen after the call, staring out the window, the paperwork in his hands, feeling the weight of what that meant. He hadn't just stepped into a role temporarily, he had built a life with them, one that was now recognized by law. And though that terrified him in some small way, it filled him with something far stronger than fear. That weekend, they went to the park together. It was a cool spring afternoon, the sun warm enough to loosen jackets, and the grass damp with morning dew. Cody brought a kite that Jason had helped him patch together with tape and string, while Cameron insisted on bringing a soccer ball that was almost half his size. They ran across the open field, laughing so loudly it made a few strangers stop and smile. Jason chased after them, not caring who saw him in his dress shoes slipping in the mud, not caring how foolish he might have looked. He couldn't remember the last time he'd laughed without thinking about what came next. As they sat on the grass eating sandwiches and juice boxes, Cameron looked up and asked suddenly, "Did you have a dad when you were little?" Jason hesitated, then said, "Not really. Not one who stayed." The boys were quiet for a moment. Then Cody said, "We didn't either. Until now." Jason felt the sting behind his eyes, but he didn't look away. He simply reached out and pulled them both into a quiet, protective hug. Later that night, as he tucked them into bed, Cody asked if their mom would ever meet him. Jason told them the truth, that he hoped so, and that if she did, he would tell her everything. How strong they were, how much they missed her, how much they had grown. He didn't promise anything he couldn't keep, but he told them the most important truth of all: no matter what happened, he wasn't leaving. Ever. As he turned off the lights and stood in the doorway, he realized the ache in his chest wasn't fear anymore. It was something deeper, something rooted. The kind of feeling that comes only when you've stopped waiting for a life to begin and started living it fully. And somewhere in the quiet of that night, Jason understood that this wasn't about what he had lost or what he had missed. It was about what he had chosen to build, piece by piece, from a single unexpected moment into something whole and lasting. The morning Sarah finally opened her eyes was quiet and cloudless. Jason had just arrived at the hospital, a coffee in one hand and the boy's newest drawings rolled up under his arm. He entered her room expecting the usual stillness, the rhythmic beeping of machines and the soft hum of the oxygen line, but something felt different the moment he stepped inside. A nurse was already there, gently adjusting Sarah's blanket, and she turned with a soft smile when she saw him. "She's awake," the nurse said simply, and Jason froze. He moved slowly toward the bed, not wanting to startle her, not wanting to believe too quickly in something he had only allowed himself to hope for in small, silent moments. Sarah looked at him with groggy, half-focused eyes. Her gaze flickered over his face, unfamiliar and familiar at once, as if her brain were racing to catch up with the world around her. He lowered himself into the chair beside her and spoke softly, telling her his name, reminding her gently of the day he met her sons. At the mention of Cody and Cameron, her eyes welled with tears. She couldn't speak yet, but she reached for his hand, and when he gave it to her, she clutched it with surprising strength. He promised her they were safe, that they were happy, that they had been so brave. He told her they had never stopped waiting for her. Over the next few days, as she slowly regained strength and comprehension, Jason visited daily. He brought the boys once she was strong enough, and the reunion was both tearful and full of laughter. Cody ran into her arms the moment he saw her, nearly knocking over her four-stand, while Cameron simply stood by the bed, his lower lip trembling until she pulled him in two. The three of them cried and clung to each other, and Jason stood back and watched with a heart so full it felt as if it would burst. He didn't interrupt. He didn't claim space. He just let them be together. Sarah learned everything in small pieces. At first she was overwhelmed, confused by how much time had passed, by how her boys had been living without her. But when she heard how Jason had stepped in, not out of obligation but out of instinct and care, she was quiet for a long time. Later that afternoon, when the boys had gone to the hospital playroom and the room was quiet again, she turned to Jason and asked the question he had been expecting but dreading. "Why did you do it?" she asked, her voice weak but steady. "You didn't know us. You could have walked away." He looked at her and answered honestly. "I tried to walk away. That night in the bar, I almost did. But then I saw them. And something in me knew that I couldn't unsee it. I didn't plan this. I didn't expect it. But they needed someone. And it turns out, I did too. Sarah listened with eyes that held both caution and warmth. She nodded slowly. They love you, she said. They talk about you like you've always been there. He smiled. I plan to be. If you'll let me. Sarah didn't respond right away. But she didn't say no. And that, for Jason, was enough. Weeks later, Sarah was strong enough to return home. Jason helped ready the apartment, fixing things she hadn't had the time or energy to deal with before. They painted the boys' room, set up a reading corner, and even hung the drawings Jason had kept. The boys insisted on a family dinner to celebrate her return, and it ended in a pillow fight that left them all breathless with laughter. There was no speech, no grand declaration, but when Jason took a photo of the four of them piled on the couch afterward, something about it felt permanent. Life didn't return to how it was before. It became something entirely new. Jason didn't just remain a part of the boys' lives, he and Sarah found themselves slowly, unexpectedly drawn to each other in ways neither had expected. There was no rush. No pressure. Just quiet dinners, long talks after bedtime, and the steady realization that sometimes love grows not out of romance, but out of the choice to stay. And in choosing them, again and again, Jason had rewritten the very structure of his life. Not with strategies or investments, but with bedtime stories, hospital visits, and small promises kept. He had found something he never thought he needed. Something he now couldn't imagine living without. Not success. Not redemption. But a family. What makes the ending of this story powerful is its quiet, earned transformation. Jason's journey isn't about saving others to redeem himself, it's about learning how to be present, vulnerable, and truly connected after years of chasing status over substance. The beauty lies in the fact that no one demanded he change, the boys didn't ask him to become a father figure, and Sarah didn't expect a savior. But he chose to show up, again and again, until love grew not from grand gestures, but from consistency, care, and the courage to build a life that wasn't perfect, just real. That's what makes the ending so satisfying, not that everyone gets what they want, but that they find what they didn't know they needed. The billionaire CEO was on his way to the biggest deal of his life, until he found a crying toddler in his first-class seat, holding a letter with his name on it. Henry Winston moved through the private boarding gate like he had 1,000 times before, efficient, precise, and without emotion. His custom-tailored suit was crisp, his watch synchronized to Tokyo time, and his mind fully absorbed in the negotiation strategy he had mentally rehearsed the entire drive to the airport. This deal would be the biggest of his career. Billions were on the line, not just for the company but for his legacy. Everything had been coordinated to the minute. His assistant had ensured his favorite seat, 13A in first class, was reserved, and his files were loaded onto his tablet, ready for final review during the flight. There was nothing unpredictable about any of it. That was how Henry operated. Control was the foundation of his world. But as he stepped into the cabin and approached row 13, something jolted his routine. His seat was occupied. And not by a fellow executive or a misassigned passenger. A small child, a toddler, maybe 3 years old, was curled up in seat 13A, clutching a stuffed bear and crying softly into the fabric of the seatbelt. He wore a white cotton sweater that looked slightly too big for his tiny frame, and his shoes had clearly been taken off somewhere along the way. His face was flushed from crying, and his wide, tear-filled blue eyes locked onto Henry's with something that made the air catch in Henry's lungs. A flight attendant quickly approached, apologizing with visible confusion. She glanced down at the boy's boarding pass, then back up at Henry. The child's name wasn't listed under any reservation. There was no guardian on the manifest. No check-in alert. No explanation. Yet somehow, this boy had been assigned to seat 13A, Henry's seat. Security was being called. A gate agent was on their way. The captain had been notified. Henry should have been frustrated. He should have insisted on immediate resolution and moved on to another seat, focusing on the billion-dollar deal awaiting him across the ocean. But he didn't. Something stopped him. He didn't understand why, but instead of stepping back, he slowly sat down in seat 13B beside the child, watching him with growing unease. The boy had stopped crying now, but his lips still trembled. Clutched in his hand, almost unnoticed beneath the edge of his sleeve, was a folded piece of paper. A name was scribbled across the front in blue marker, Henry Winston. Henry's chest tightened as he reached out and gently took the letter, unfolding it with growing dread. The handwriting inside was uneven but familiar. He hadn't seen it in years, but he knew it instantly. Eliza. The letter was short, almost rushed, written with a shaking hand. If you're reading this, it means I couldn't go on. I'm sorry. His name is Thomas. He's yours. I had nothing left to give him, but you still have everything. Please don't leave him. For a moment, Henry couldn't process the words. They didn't make sense. Eliza. The woman he had once loved but left behind when ambition took priority. They hadn't spoken in years. She had vanished from his life so completely that sometimes he wondered if she had ever really been in it at all. And now she was reaching out, not for herself, but for a child. His child. He looked back at the boy. Thomas. The resemblance was impossible to ignore now. The shape of his jaw. The curve of his eyebrows. Those bright blue eyes, Henry's mother used to say they were like glass marbles. He had the same. He felt the plane around him fade into the background, the murmurs of confused passengers, the rushed steps of crew members, the mechanical chime of the boarding door. All of it dissolved into a single, undeniable moment. A child had been placed in his seat, with his name on a letter, and no one else in the world coming for him. The flight was grounded. Security needed answers. But Henry wasn't thinking about Tokyo anymore. He was thinking about Eliza, about the choices he'd made, and the boy now resting quietly against the seat with tear stains on his cheeks. This wasn't a mistake. It was a message. A call. A second chance. And for the first time in years, Henry Winston didn't know what happened next. All he knew was that he wasn't getting on that flight. The terminal was quieter than usual once the flight to Tokyo officially closed its doors without him. Henry sat in a glass-walled observation area overlooking the runway, his suit jacket draped over the armrest of a chair that suddenly felt far too stiff. Thomas was asleep beside him, curled up in a fleece blanket one of the attendants had brought earlier, his head resting gently on Henry's lap. Every now and then, his small hand would twitch, fingers grasping for something even in sleep. Henry didn't move. He didn't scroll through his phone. He didn't check emails. All he could do was sit there, unmoving, as the weight of the letter burned in his pocket. The gate agents had done their job. They notified the airline security, called in social services, and double-checked the manifest for any trace of guardianship. Nothing turned up. The name, Eliza Morgan, had triggered a match in the system. She had purchased a ticket under her own name weeks earlier, but never boarded. No luggage. No contact. No one waiting on the other end. She had quite literally disappeared, leaving only the boy, the letter, and a signature that Henry hadn't seen in nearly 4 years. The social worker who arrived didn't recognize him at first. He introduced himself politely, clipboard in hand, prepared to follow procedure. But once he heard Henry's name, something shifted. Everyone knew who Henry Winston was. CEO. Public figure. Fortune covers. Forbes lists. The idea that this child, sitting with tear-dried cheeks and unmatched socks, could be his was not something the system was equipped to handle with quiet efficiency. Henry didn't care about protocol. All he wanted was to understand how it had come to this. How Eliza, independent, proud, complicated Eliza, could leave her son, their son, in an airplane seat with nothing but a note and a hope. And maybe, Henry realized, it wasn't really hope. Maybe it was desperation. Maybe it was love that had run out of places to go. The social worker explained the next steps. Custodial investigation. Emergency placement. Possible DNA confirmation. Paperwork. Court hearings. Henry nodded, understanding the process but already knowing the outcome. He didn't need a test. He could feel it in his bones, in the curve of the boy's cheek, in the instinct that had taken root the moment Thomas looked up at him. This wasn't a stranger's child. This was his son. And he wasn't going to let him vanish into a system. When Thomas woke up, he didn't cry. He simply sat up slowly, blinking at the bright lights above them, and looked at Henry with a strange sort of stillness. There was no fear in his expression. Just exhaustion and confusion, the kind only children who have lived through too much too soon can carry in their eyes. "Are we going home?" he asked, voice barely louder than a whisper. Henry didn't answer right away. The word home struck something deep in him, something he hadn't felt in years. Home wasn't the penthouse with glass walls and a view of the skyline. It wasn't boardrooms or chauffeurs or curated dinners with investors. Home was wherever Thomas felt safe. And if Henry had any chance of becoming that place, he'd take it. "We're going somewhere safe," he said carefully. "Somewhere just for us." He took Thomas's hand, small, warm, still sticky from the juice box he'd been given earlier, and led him out of the terminal. His driver looked startled when he saw them, but didn't ask questions. Henry gave him a new address, one he hadn't said out loud in years. His mother's old house. It was nestled in a quiet neighborhood an hour outside the city, a place he had visited every summer as a boy before life pulled him into the current of ambition. The house had sat empty since she passed, its windows shuttered and garden overgrown. But it was still standing, still full of echoes, and still waiting. That night, Henry laid Thomas down on the old guest-room bed and sat beside him until his breathing steadied into sleep. He didn't open his laptop. He didn't call Tokyo. He just sat there, watching the boy who had arrived in his life like a storm, quiet on the surface, but deep enough to reshape everything. Outside the window, the wind stirred through the tall grass. Inside, Henry Winston, for the first time in his life, did not feel like a man chasing success. He felt like a man trying to become someone worth coming home to. The days that followed moved with an unfamiliar kind of slowness, as if time itself had paused to make room for something entirely new. Henry woke up early each morning, not to check the markets or prepare for a video conference, but because Thomas was stirring in the next room, murmuring softly in his sleep or padding barefoot across the hardwood floors looking for breakfast. The boy's presence filled the quiet house in a way that unsettled and soothed Henry at once. It had been years since he had lived with anyone else, he was used to silence, to perfect order. But now, every surface was slowly being taken over by scattered toys, stray crumbs, and the warm chaos of a child learning to feel safe. Henry made cereal on the first morning. He poured too much milk, used the wrong kind of spoon, and handed it to Thomas without realizing the bowl was freezing from the fridge. The boy didn't complain. He simply sat at the old wooden table, swinging his legs, and ate quietly, glancing up at Henry now and then as if trying to decide whether he could trust him. Henry sat across from him, still in yesterday's shirt, unsure of what to say or do, except that he couldn't look away. Every movement Thomas made felt surreal. It was like watching a distant memory play out in front of him, familiar, yet painfully new. In the afternoon, Henry took Thomas into town to buy him clothes, something warm, shoes that fit. The boy held his hand without being asked. At the store, the clerk tried to make small talk, "Is this your grandson?" And Henry's response caught even him by surprise. "He's my son." The words felt heavy and strange in his mouth, not because they weren't true, but because he had never said them before. He saw Thomas's face turn slightly toward him at that moment, his eyes widening just a little. The boy didn't speak, but something shifted in the air between them, a thin thread of connection pulling tighter. That evening, after Thomas fell asleep curled up on the couch, Henry walked outside into the cool dusk and sat on the front steps of the house, staring at the overgrown garden. He hadn't been back here in so long. The last time, he had been too busy, too impatient, too distracted by things that now felt embarrassingly hollow. He had missed so much. Not just the years he could have had with Eliza, but the little things, the first smile, the first word, the nights with fevers, the early drawings hung proudly on a wall. He thought about Eliza constantly. What had she gone through? What had driven her to that final decision, to put her son on a plane alone, carrying only a letter and a memory? She had always been strong, sharp, unwilling to be pitted or caged. She had loved fiercely, and he had once believed that would last forever, until he let ambition drown out everything else. Now all he had was the son she left behind, and the guilt that maybe, if he had stayed, things would have been different. But guilt wasn't useful anymore. Thomas didn't need apologies. He needed presence. Stability. Patience. Love. Henry didn't know how to be a father. Not really. But he knew how to stay. And that, he was beginning to realize, was more than enough to start with. The next day, he called the attorney handling the emergency guardianship process. He didn't want temporary custody. He wanted it permanent. He wanted every signature, every form, every evaluation needed to make it official. There were court dates to schedule, documents to file, a DNA test to confirm what his heart already knew. He'd go through all of it. Not out of obligation, but out of choice. A conscious, deliberate choice. When he came home that evening, Thomas ran to him with a drawing clutched in one hand. It was crude, drawn in thick crayon lines, but unmistakable. A tall man holding the hand of a small boy beneath a crooked sun. Above them, in uneven letters, was written one word, Dad. Henry knelt down, took the picture, and looked at Thomas. He didn't say anything for a moment. He just pulled the boy into a gentle hug, not too tight, but close enough to feel how real he was. That night, when the house finally grew quiet, Henry stood by the door of Thomas's room and watched him sleep. He didn't feel lost anymore. He didn't feel unsure. He felt chosen. And that changed everything. By the fourth week, the house no longer felt like a place Henry had returned to, it felt like a place being rewritten, one memory at a time. The silence that once echoed through the halls was now filled with footsteps too small to be heard unless you were listening closely. Thomas had taken to singing softly to himself in the mornings, a series of made-up tunes that always changed but somehow made perfect sense to him. The house, once a monument to a life of order and ambition, now bore signs of imperfection that Henry found strangely comforting: a sock under the coffee table, fingerprints on the glass doors, a crayon drawing stuck to the refrigerator with a magnet that used to hold tax forms. Henry was learning how to adjust, not in grand gestures, but in 100 tiny, humbling ways. He had learned that Thomas hated the smell of eggs and loved apples with the skin peeled. He knew the boy needed 2 stories before bed, no matter how tired he was. He knew Thomas was afraid of loud toilets and that he would only wear pajamas with animals on them. He also knew that the nightmares came twice a week, always just before midnight, and that the boy would call for him softly, unsure if it was okay to wake him. Henry never hesitated. He would come into the room, sit on the edge of the bed, and rub his back until the fear melted away. There were no speeches, no explanations. Just presence. And slowly, that presence was becoming something Thomas could rely on. During the days, Henry began to navigate the unfamiliar world of early childhood. He enrolled Thomas in a local preschool under a temporary guardianship agreement and met with teachers who asked him about routines, favorite toys, food allergies, emotional triggers. He answered as best he could, filled out forms he never imagined completing, and sat through orientation meetings where he was just another parent in a room full of people balancing snacks and toddlers and exhaustion. And surprisingly, he didn't feel out of place. He felt human. Grounded. He had spent years at the top of skyscrapers, giving speeches about vision and strategy, but here, among sticky tables and alphabet charts, he felt closer to something real than he ever had in his glass office. The case with social services moved forward. The DNA test came back, confirmation of paternity, though Henry hadn't needed proof. The official custody process had begun, and while it might take weeks or months to finalize, no one questioned his commitment. The system, cautious as it was, recognized when someone showed up not for obligation but because they refused to leave. Amber, the social worker assigned to their case, was young but sharp, with kind eyes and a steady voice. She visited often to check on Thomas, but also on Henry. She asked about routines, about emotional bonding, about Henry's long-term plans. At first, he gave calculated answers, logical, structured, well-reasoned. But as time passed, his answers changed. He spoke not about plans, but about moments. About how Thomas hugged him tighter every week. About how bedtime had become his favorite part of the day. About how the boy had begun calling him Dad without hesitation. Amber listened, took notes, and once, after a particularly quiet visit, said something that stayed with him: sometimes, love doesn't need a timeline. It just needs proof that you're still there. Henry carried those words with him. They reminded him that he didn't need to be perfect. He just needed to be consistent. When Thomas cried over broken toys, he didn't try to fix them right away. He listened first. When the boy laughed too loudly in restaurants, he didn't hush him. He laughed too. When Thomas asked why his mommy couldn't come back, Henry didn't offer false hope. He held him and told the truth, that she had loved him, that she had done her best, and that now, it was Henry's job to make sure he never had to feel that alone again. One night, after Thomas had fallen asleep with his arms wrapped around a toy firetruck, Henry sat in the living room with a cup of tea, looking through old photos he had dug out of a forgotten box in the attic. Most were of his childhood, his mother, a few blurry shots of Eliza. In one photo, she was sitting in the grass, barefoot, her eyes closed, sunlight on her face. He stared at it for a long time, guilt and love mingling in a way that made his chest ache. He whispered a thank you he knew she would never hear. Not just for Thomas, but for trusting him, even after everything. As the fire crackled and the house settled into night, Henry realized he no longer felt like a man pausing his life for someone else. He wasn't on a break from success. He wasn't waiting to return to what he had lost. He was building something new. Something that didn't need applause, only love. And for the first time in years, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Winter crept in slowly, wrapping the town in early darkness and cold mornings that required extra blankets and gloves too small for Henry to figure out without help. Life had found a rhythm now, and while it was far from easy, it was no longer unfamiliar. Thomas had started calling the house our place, and each time he said it, Henry felt something shift quietly inside him, like the foundation of his life was settling into place for the first time. The days were filled with school drop-offs, grocery runs, bedtime routines, and small miracles, a laugh after a tantrum, a picture drawn with "Dad" written at the top, the soft weight of a child falling asleep against his chest during a movie he hadn't planned to watch. One gray morning, while Henry was helping Thomas zip up his jacket, the doorbell rang. It was unexpected. Very few people knew where they lived now, and Henry had intentionally kept it that way. When he opened the door, he was met with a woman in a long black coat, her expression professional but unreadable. She introduced herself as Rachel Myers, a lawyer representing a man named Curtis, Eliza's former partner, someone Henry had never met but had heard about in vague, uncomfortable tones. Rachel handed Henry an envelope containing legal documents. Curtis was filing a petition. He wanted joint custody of Thomas, claiming he had played a parental role in the boy's early life and had the right to continue doing so. Henry's entire body went still. He thanked her without emotion, closed the door, and locked it behind him, as if that simple gesture could keep the outside world from coming in. He read the documents slowly, twice, then a third time. The words felt sharp and clinical, filled with accusations that boiled down to one thing: doubt. Curtis claimed Henry had no real connection to Thomas, that he had shown up late, that his motivation was rooted in guilt, not love. The petition painted a version of the story Henry didn't recognize, one where he was a stranger to his son, where the bond they had built was nothing more than a temporary solution to a tragic inconvenience. Henry didn't tell Thomas. He didn't know how. The boy was still too young to understand the machinery of the legal system, too young to grasp the idea that someone might try to take him away. But Henry understood. He knew the courts would ask questions. They would examine his life, his decisions, his past. They would look for weakness, for gaps in consistency, for signs that he wasn't ready, that he wasn't enough. The next few days felt heavier. Thomas noticed the tension even if he didn't understand it. He started waking up more at night, asking if Henry would still be there in the morning. He drew pictures with darker colors. His questions became more pointed. Why don't I have a mom anymore? Why do other kids have two houses? Henry answered as honestly as he could without unraveling. He told Thomas that not all families looked the same, but that didn't make them any less real. He told him that love was not about matching stories, it was about showing up every day, no matter what. Henry called Amber, the social worker, and they met in the dining room while Thomas was at school. She listened as he explained everything, her brow furrowed, her hands calm around a mug of tea. When he finished, she sighed and said, "Custody battles like this aren't uncommon, but they're always hard. You've done everything right so far, but the courts won't just look at that. They'll look at the past. They'll ask why you weren't there before." Henry nodded. "Because I didn't know. And now that I do, I'm not leaving." Amber didn't smile, but her eyes softened. "Then keep showing them that. Not just the court, Thomas too." With her guidance, Henry gathered everything. Photos. School records. Letters from teachers. Notes from Thomas. Even the drawing that still hung on the refrigerator. He submitted character references. He met with child psychologists. He told his story without embellishment, just truth. The hearing was scheduled for mid-December. As the date approached, Henry found himself slowing down in the evenings. He would sit longer with Thomas after bedtime stories, run his fingers through the boy's hair, and memorize the shape of his breathing. He stopped checking his email entirely. The only schedule he followed was the one that revolved around school lunches and morning hugs. One night, while they sat on the couch watching a holiday cartoon, Thomas looked up and said, "If they make me go away, can I come back anyway?" Henry's heart cracked clean down the middle. He took the boy into his arms, held him tight, and whispered, "No one is taking you away. Not while I'm here." And he meant it. Every word. Because love, Henry had come to learn, was not always enough to stop pain. But it was enough to stand in front of it, hold the line, and refuse to let it win. The courthouse was gray and quiet on the morning of the hearing. Snow had started falling just before dawn, blanketing the streets in a thin, untouched layer that seemed to slow everything down. Henry arrived early, dressed in a dark suit that felt heavier than it used to, not because of the fabric, but because of the weight of everything it represented now. He wasn't here as a CEO or a public figure. He was here as a father, one who had spent every day for the last 2 months building something out of nothing, learning how to love a child who had been a stranger to him, and trying to become someone that child could count on without question. Amber met him at the entrance. She had a folder tucked under one arm and a tired but reassuring look in her eyes. They walked through the halls together in silence until they reached the family courtroom, a modest space with worn benches and soft lighting that felt more like a waiting room than a battlefield. On the far side of the room sat Curtis, the man who had filed the petition. He was taller than Henry expected, dressed well, his expression unreadable. He didn't acknowledge Henry. He just sat beside his lawyer, hands clasped tightly in front of him. The judge entered shortly after and asked for both sides to present their cases. Curtis's lawyer went first, reading from a prepared statement filled with vague but pointed claims. He painted Curtis as a long-time emotional presence in Thomas's life, someone who had stepped in when no one else did. He spoke of Eliza with respect, but also as someone overwhelmed by her circumstances. He implied that Henry had stepped in only when things became convenient and that his relationship with Thomas, though well-meaning, lacked foundation. Henry listened without interrupting. He didn't flinch when the lawyer described him as emotionally unavailable, or when he questioned the sincerity of Henry's motives. He had prepared for this. He had expected it. And when it was his turn to speak, he didn't read from a statement. He stood, looked directly at the judge, and spoke from the place where all of this had begun. He told the truth. He told them how he hadn't known Thomas existed until the moment he saw him on that plane. How the boy had been left with nothing but a note and his name. How he had taken him home not out of guilt or responsibility, but out of something deeper, something he didn't have words for then but understood now: instinct, connection, the overwhelming feeling that this child belonged to him, not because of blood, but because of the bond that had formed in the weeks since. He talked about bedtime routines and scraped knees, about early mornings filled with cereal and coloring books, about the way Thomas had started calling him Dad without ever being asked to. He didn't cry, though his voice caught once, when he said, "This isn't something I'm doing for Thomas. This is something we're building together. Every single day. He's not my obligation. He's my son." After his testimony, Amber presented her report. She spoke of Thomas's progress, of the emotional stability he had gained, of the strength of the relationship she had observed between them. She referenced the letters from Thomas's teachers, the consistent involvement in his life, and the way Henry had chosen to change the course of his entire world just to stay close to one little boy. The psychologist echoed her report, noting that removing Thomas from Henry's care at this stage would likely cause more harm than any possible benefit. The judge asked a few final questions, then called a short recess. Henry stepped outside into the hallway, leaning against the wall near a vending machine that flickered weakly in the corner. He felt empty, not from fatigue, but from the emotional cost of having to prove something he already knew in his bones. He wanted to be back home. He wanted to pick up Thomas from school and take him to the park and read him the same story 3 times in a row just because he asked. He didn't want to fight anymore. He just wanted to live. When the court reconvened, the judge returned with her ruling. Her tone was measured, but her words were clear. Curtis's petition was denied. Legal custody would remain with Henry, and the court recognized him as the primary guardian with full parental rights. There was no applause. No dramatic moment of celebration. Just quiet stillness and the sound of Henry releasing a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. Later that day, when he picked Thomas up from school, the boy ran toward him with the same unfiltered joy he always had. Henry knelt, caught him mid-run, and held him close, letting the cold air sting his eyes for a moment longer than necessary. He didn't explain what had happened in court. He didn't need to. He simply said, "Let's go home." And Thomas, smiling wide and warm against his shoulder, whispered back, "Our home." That was all that mattered. The weeks that followed the custody ruling felt like stepping into a new season of life, one Henry hadn't known he was waiting for. The tension that had quietly lived beneath the surface of every moment was finally gone. No more court dates. No more paperwork. No more watching every move with the fear that someone would question whether he belonged in his son's life. What remained was routine, not the kind dictated by business calendars and global meetings, but the kind made up of school pickups, spilled juice, bedtime laughter, and tiny socks that never stayed in pairs no matter how often he tried to organize them. Thomas had begun to change too. The fear in his eyes, the caution in his tone, the slight flinch when someone raised their voice, all of it began to fade. He smiled more, talked more, asked more questions. He had started drawing daily, pictures of their house, of the two of them holding hands, of rockets and dogs and sometimes things he couldn't explain but always called ours. Henry kept every one, taping them to the walls, the fridge, even the mirror in the hallway, until their home felt less like a restored memory and more like a living scrapbook of a boy reclaiming his childhood. Amber visited one last time for a final check-in. She walked through the house slowly, noting how Thomas clung to Henry's leg in a playful way, how naturally he moved through the space, how he pointed to his own room as "my spot" with a pride that was impossible to fake. She sat down with Henry in the kitchen after Thomas had gone outside to chase leaves in the wind and told him simply, "You did it." Not because the court said so, but because he did. He trusts you. And that's all the proof that ever mattered. Henry didn't know what to say. He wasn't used to praise that felt so personal. But Amber wasn't the type to linger. She left him with a signed document and a smile that didn't need words. That night, Henry made spaghetti from scratch for the first time. It was messy, wildly uneven, and Thomas declared it, kinda weird but still yummy. They ate sitting on the floor of the living room because the table was covered in Lego creations they had both agreed were too important to move. After dinner, they built a blanket fort. It wasn't very sturdy, and Henry bumped his head twice, but they read books inside it until Thomas fell asleep against his chest, breathing softly, fingers still tangled in the edge of Henry's shirt like a child who finally knew he was safe. In the quiet of that moment, Henry looked around at the chaos of pillows, books, and mismatched blankets, and realized he no longer missed the skyline view from his penthouse. He no longer felt the urge to check stock reports or performance projections. He didn't crave the approval of investors or the thrill of closing another impossible deal. He had traded all of that for something far simpler and infinitely more profound, a life made up of presence, of shared moments, of unconditional love offered without expectation. He thought of Eliza more gently now. Not with guilt, but with gratitude. She had made the hardest decision of her life to ensure that Thomas had a chance. And somewhere deep in his bones, Henry believed she would have been proud of how it turned out. Not because he had done everything right, but because he hadn't run. Because he had stayed. As winter melted into early spring, Henry and Thomas began walking to school instead of driving. They talked about everything and nothing, about frogs and clouds and whether cereal should be cold or hot. On weekends, they worked on the backyard together, planting tiny seedlings that Thomas insisted would grow into trees taller than the house. Henry didn't argue. He let the boy believe in magic because, for the first time in his life, he kind of believed in it too. He was still learning how to be a father. There were mistakes, impatience, moments when he questioned himself. But there was no more doubt about whether he belonged in this life. He did. And every day, Thomas showed him that being a parent wasn't about doing it all perfectly. It was about being the one who stays, who listens, who shows up again and again. And Henry, a man who had once built towers out of steel and glass, was now building something even stronger, one bedtime story, one school project, one whispered, "I love you," at a time. Spring arrived quietly, with rain that soaked the streets and small bursts of green pushing up through the earth like promises. The world outside was waking up again, but inside Henry's home, it felt like something had already bloomed. There was a calmness in the way the mornings began now, a rhythm to the life they'd created that no longer felt temporary or fragile. It was real. Thomas had stopped asking questions like, "Will I stay here?" or "Are you leaving?" Instead, he talked about summer plans and whether they could build a treehouse, if maybe they could get a dog, and if Henry would come to his school talent show even if he didn't win anything. Henry said yes to all of it. They no longer needed the nightlight. Thomas no longer needed the lullabies whispered at midnight to fall back asleep. But sometimes, Henry still sat beside his bed, not because the boy needed it, but because he did. He had once feared he wouldn't know how to love someone unconditionally, that the years he had spent living for ambition had made him too hard, too distant, too unfit for something as soft and pure as fatherhood. But now, as he watched Thomas grow, taller, more confident, filled with opinions and imagination, he understood that love had reshaped him entirely. It had reached places no success ever could. One Saturday afternoon, Henry received a letter in the mail, one that caught him off guard. It was handwritten, postmarked from a small town he didn't recognize. Inside was a note from Eliza's sister, someone he had never met. The letter wasn't long. It simply said, "I don't know what happened between you and Eliza. She never talked much about the past. But I do know she loved that boy more than anything, and that she made the hardest choice a mother ever could. I think she'd want you to know that she hoped you'd find each other. Thank you for not turning away." Henry sat with that letter for a long time. He hadn't realized how much he needed that small piece of grace, from someone who had known Eliza when he hadn't. It didn't change what had happened, and it didn't ease the ache that sometimes still settled in his chest when he thought of her. But it gave him something else, closure, or at least a kind of peace. Later that day, Thomas found him sitting alone in the kitchen, the letter folded on the table. The boy climbed into his lap and, without asking what was wrong, wrapped his arms around Henry's neck. They stayed like that for a while. No questions, no explanations. Just a father and a son, holding each other in the quiet certainty that they had found exactly where they belonged. That evening, Henry cooked dinner, nothing fancy, just grilled cheese and tomato soup, Thomas's favorite. They ate on the porch, watching the rain taper off into a light drizzle. Thomas asked if they could go somewhere together in the summer, maybe a beach or a mountain or even just a cabin in the woods. He didn't care where, as long as it was with Henry. And Henry promised they would, that they'd go anywhere he wanted. It wasn't about the destination. It was about the time. Before bed, Thomas handed Henry a new drawing. This one had more detail than usual: trees, a swing, a little red house with a sun above it. Two figures stood in front, one tall, one small. Both smiling. Above them, in blocky crayon letters, were the words, "Our beginning." Henry hung it next to the others. He no longer thought about the life he used to live, not with longing, not even with regret. That life had ended the moment he saw a crying child in seat 13A, holding a letter with his name on it. Everything that came after that wasn't a detour. It was the real path, the one he hadn't known existed. Now, he didn't wake up chasing deadlines. He woke up to little feet on the stairs, to sleepy voices asking for pancakes, to a life that was quieter, smaller, but infinitely more full. He had once believed that his legacy would be the buildings he left behind, the empire he built from nothing. But as he stood in Thomas's doorway that night, watching the boy drift to sleep with peace on his face and crayons still scattered across the bed, he realized that this was the only legacy that mattered. And in the deepest part of him, Henry knew he hadn't just saved Thomas. Thomas had saved him too. What makes the ending of this story so powerful is how quietly it speaks. It doesn't need a grand twist or a dramatic climax, because the real transformation happens slowly, through presence, patience, and love. Henry's journey from detached executive to devoted father is not only believable, it's deeply moving. It shows that healing doesn't come from fixing the past, but from choosing to show up fully in the present. The most touching part, for me, is how the story honors both the child's innocence and the adult's capacity for change. Thomas isn't just a symbol of redemption, he's a whole person who teaches Henry how to be human again. And Henry, despite his flaws and late start, earns something money could never buy: trust, connection, and the right to be called Dad. It's a reminder that the most meaningful legacies aren't built in boardrooms or measured in billions. They're built in bedtime stories, kitchen table drawings, and the quiet promise to never walk away.